Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our closing session. We are joined here with Justin De La Cruz, who is the head of Data Science, Instructional Design, and Technology Department at the Atlanta University Center, Robert W. Woodruff Library, where he works with faculty, staff, and students on digital literacy and educational technology. He also serves on the editorial advisory board of Library High Tech and as the chair of the American Library Association's Committee on Library Advocacy. Justin has worked in public and academic libraries since 2011 and enjoys advocating for all types of libraries. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you very much, Megan, for the invitation, and thank you to the conference for having me. I'm glad to see so many people here, and I'm hoping to have some exchange of ideas and thoughts in the chat. And also, if you feel like unmuting to talk, to jump in on some of the reflection questions that we have during the talk. So hopefully you've engaged in the conference and you're all excited about libraries, and we're going to talk about how to translate that energy into advocacy for libraries. And so as Megan mentioned, I'm going to share my screen really quick. I am the chair for the Committee on Library Advocacy for ALA. And if you don't know what that committee does, we're engaged with grassroots advocacy across the United States, and specifically with advocating for libraries of all types and all formats to state legislators and community members who make a difference in funding and support for libraries. So that is where I'm coming from. So if you wanted to drop in the chat where you're coming from, what kind of position you have, and what your interests are, and maybe what you think about advocacy, then I might be able to use some of those responses to sort of direct some of the discussion going forward too. So feel free to share. I'm here for you and to talk to your interests, and I'll try and keep the chat open while we go along. So my focus today is talking about how to generate an advocacy plan. And I think I'm going to get there through a bit of a winding road of information and thoughts on different topics. And hopefully we'll all land out the other side with an idea of how to advocate for libraries and why it's important to do that. And hopefully we'll get some of your feedback on this topic too, since you know a lot more about your communities. And that's a really essential part of advocacy, is knowing who you're talking to and what you're talking about. So I wouldn't want to talk to you about your own community interests. I think you know those a lot better than I do. So I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly and hopefully inspire you to figure out what those interests are and how you can leverage them into advocacy for libraries. Thanks for the responses. Please continue to chat as you feel comfortable doing so in the chat box. So like I said, we're going to have a talk today, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts and stories, and hopefully you'll at least reflect on your own, if not share them with us, so we can all learn together. And if we have time and energy and the capacity, maybe we can have some short discussions too built in. And so like I said, it might be a little bit of a winding road, but hopefully we'll hang in there together and see how it all comes together at the end of the talk. So the outline for today, I was thinking broadly about, what does advocacy mean to me? And I had to go back to, what do libraries mean to me, and why I got into this work and what I've done so far and what I enjoy about doing it. And so we'll talk a little bit about libraries as communities, and then we'll talk about how there's a lot of love for libraries out there already. So I think we have a bit of advantage when we start talking about how to advocate for libraries. Then we'll talk about, how advocacy works, the different levels of advocating and what we can do as individuals and as groups. And then we'll try and put it all together into what might be your advocacy plan at the end. And I'll show you some resources and other things that you can map onto some of the concepts that we're talking about. So libraries are communities, and I think this is a big talking point for us and things that we know. And stuff that we say to ourselves all the time. I remember when I got first hired in a public library in South Florida, the whole talk was about, libraries as community centers, always trying to stay on message with that when we talk to patrons and when we talk to business leaders and community leaders and board members is that libraries are actually community centers. They're more than just items and more than just staff. They're actually how people move through those spaces and what they do with each other in those spaces. And so we know this pretty much inside and out from what we do every day. But do our funders know this, and do people outside of libraries know this? So the first reflection I'm hoping that you can do, and feel free to do on your own. You don't have to share, but if you'd like to share in the chat, maybe I can read out some of the ones that pop up. So write down 3 things in your local libraries or library systems, 3 things that they do that are particularly helpful or specific to your community. And so this could be anything that you think of. Hopefully the first thing that pops into your head, not something you have to think real hard about. And this could be your place of work or just libraries in your community that you may use or not use, but you know about. It could be anything from, you know, a story time to the ability to get interlibrary loans. It could be helping with taxes or helping with job searches, or any particular thing about your specific community's libraries that you think are very helpful to your community. All right, so I see, oh, daycare, school outreach. All right. One-on-one appointments, story times, interlibrary loan, hoopla, online programs. You know, you say hoopla, it's a bit of a word that everybody knows in libraries. You go outside of libraries and say hoopla and see how many people know what you're talking about. But yeah, so we have things that we know about, and we have things that we celebrate within our libraries. And we have a lot of libraries doing a lot of good for a lot of communities. So these are just a very few number of examples, of prominent examples of libraries helping out during trying times, especially these COVID times. And so libraries have responded directly to COVID closures and the pressures that people face in society now. And we have a piece from the Observer about, you know, how these closures kind of reveal to people what extent libraries serve their communities and how much impact they have, and all the kinds of different services that they provide to their communities. And so it's more than just books, which is, you know, one of the slogans we have at my library. There's a lot more that we do that helps people who come through our libraries. And now we're doing them online, and we have been doing them online, but now people are noticing that. So after the shockwave of lockdowns and everything happening, there's been a lot of public support for library services online, including ebooks, and I guess we're doing curbside lending and now stuff like that. And this article was just saying that people have taken notice of this. People in the US and the UK have noticed, and all over have noticed that libraries show their resilience and their adaptability by stepping in to fill these gaps where possible, even when crisis is there. And so they're saying in this article, especially, that the governments are taking notice, so hopefully it'll be something that we can easily share with them in terms of how our communities appreciate it. And I did put out a small call for like inspiring stories from social media. One of my friends said that he was traveling in Miami and had to do some remote work. And he said he needed to send large files. The Wi-Fi wasn't working. So he actually went to the Miami Beach Public Library and didn't have to sign up for anything. Just, you know, went in, stayed as long as he needed to, and had a good view. And this is one of the things that I like to promote to people outside of libraries, is that it's one of the last free spaces in society where you don't have to necessarily buy anything just to exist in that space. You know, a lot of stores will want you to buy something, or if you go to a restaurant, you obviously have to order something. And in libraries, there's not that expectation. You may have to sign up for something like a card if you need to use a particular service, but most of the time you can just walk right in, make yourself at home, and you don't have to sign up for anything or pay for anything. So that's a great talking point to have in your back pocket when people talk about um, uh, what's the purpose of libraries and what do they do for communities and for people, is that they're a free meeting space that anybody can use at any time. This is another example, and going back a few years, is that the Ferguson Library got a lot of headlines during the civil unrest and around Mike Brown's killing, and the headlines were positive about the library's efforts. So despite the tumult, Ferguson Library keeps its doors open, and there's tweets from Ferguson Library there too. And so the idea being that people see when this kind of stuff happens. So when there are closures, when there's unrest, when there's things going on, people look to community centers, and it's not just libraries, other places help out too. But it's very visible to people when they can trust their libraries to stay open, to stay supportive during trying times like these, like COVID and like protests and violence and things like that. So it's very impactful in the national narrative and the local narratives to show libraries providing these kinds of services, especially when things might not be going the way we want them to outside of library doors. And then this is dipping back even more a few years, and it's right around the time when I started studying about libraries in grad school, is that even though it wasn't a tried and true official brick and mortar traditional library, there was the Occupy Wall Street library that they called the People's Library. And they established thousands of books. They had systems for people organizing them, volunteers organizing them, providing laptops and internet access, talking about books, and basically just giving them away. They weren't really checking them out. But, leave a book, take a book. But the whole idea is that even in this time when people were trying to connect and they were trying to advocate for something, a bigger purpose in society, they felt that it was really necessary to have the services, or at least the idea of a library, at the heart of their movement. And so they established a physical library where they were protesting in New York City. So I thought that was pretty powerful and interesting, that the idea and the concept of a library extends throughout society and is pretty much embedded and seems to be one of the core services that people enjoy and expect from a society like ours. So if we can assume that libraries represent communities, like I said, then how do we translate this concept into library advocacy? And then also look at your earlier reflections on library services and think about who could benefit from those services. So there are obviously services available, if it's daycare or if it's interlibrary loan, people are using those services, and that's why those services stay alive. But who else could benefit? And you can think about other groups in your communities that might use those services, and if they might know about them or they might not. So this could be something like an after-school program, or a group of local businesses, or maybe a community theater. And they might like to know about homework help at your libraries, or conversation circles for learning foreign languages, or resources for writing grants, which is important. So think about those kinds of things and those kinds of connections. And this is how you start to build on advocacy, as you think about all the connections we have in society. And we think about what we offer and what goes on outside of libraries and how we can connect those dots. So if you have any ideas on this, feel free to put them into the chat. But I will give you just a minute on these reflection slides to just think about it and give you some space to reflect on it. So the next section, I wanted to talk a little bit about public perception of libraries, which is overall pretty good. And I think almost every time they poll people, there's very positive attitudes towards libraries. And like I said, it seems to be a natural public good that people expect nowadays. And even people who are not particularly interested or use libraries, they tend to still have a majority positive view on what libraries do and how important they are to communities. So it's another moment of reflection to think about 3 people that you could call on to voice support for your local libraries. And these would be people outside of the library, so not just people you work with and not people you already see using the library, but who else do you know in your life or in your professional life outside of libraries that would help you out in some moment of need. So you might not have to ask them to join you on a crusade and march to the town hall and speak several hours about libraries and their benefits. But maybe if you had a petition or if you had a town hall meeting or some other action that you wanted them to participate in, a share on social media, or ask them come to a library event, who are those kinds of people that would show up to those kinds of things? And this is a very personal thing, so you obviously don't have to share this in the chat. But think about that as we go through this next section. So the good news is that looking at the research, Pew Research in 2016 is saying that people think closing their public libraries would hurt communities. So we have people over the age of 16 saying that there would be a major impact on their community, 66% of people, if libraries were closing, and a minor impact is 25%. And then the impact on them and their families individually and specifically, it's more of a split between a major impact, a third of respondents, minor impact, a third of respondents, and no impact, a third of respondents. What's interesting is that when I was just searching broadly on this topic, something came up in JSTOR from ALA Bulletin in 1945. And somewhat similar study, somewhat similar results from a public opinion piece survey in 1945, or maybe the year right before. And they asked how much a difference it would make to the city if there were no public library, and 78% said a great deal. An additional 16% said it would be quite a bit. So that kind of mirrors the question on the left in terms of, it's about 94% of people that are interested in that. So 9 out of 10 people in 1945 think of public libraries as a value asset to the community. And then I thought it was interesting that also when they were asked if they had library cards, 41% said they didn't. So even though that people in this survey were saying that it's an important public good, 90% of people thought that. Not 90% of people actually had a library card to engage with the library in that way. So the idea here is that throughout the ages, throughout the years in the United States, we've had pretty broad public support for public libraries. And I think people recognize the good they have, even if they might have some antiquated notions about what public libraries are, which we'll talk about very shortly. They at least recognize it as a public good, like alongside other public goods that are similar. So the not so good news, I think we're at an inherent advantage because of public opinion, but the not so good news that you've probably seen alongside me these few years that I've been a librarian, since 2011, is that every once in a while, there's an article that pops up and it just said, libraries, what are they good for? Nothing. And it's a trope by now, but it happens, I'd say at least once a year. It felt like it was happening a whole lot more like 2016, 2017 for some reason. But this is from 2018, and it was a Forbes piece that actually got deleted, I think about a week after it was posted, just because of the huge public outcry I got. But I was able to find it on the Internet Archive, so the link is there for that. And I'm going to send you the link to for this talk in the chat at the end, and then also as an email to Megan, so you can have that. But basically, this piece was saying, Amazon should replace local libraries because it would save everybody money. And so it's saying that Amazon should open their own bookstores, which they have started doing in all local communities, and they can replace local libraries because their model is so much better than the library model for obtaining books and things like that. And so this author goes into this whole, and he was an economist, by the way, he goes into this whole argument about, the dollars and cents of the matter and all that kind of stuff without having, looked at return on investment studies for libraries, or probably even looking at any statistics for what libraries do economically. But more of just kind of a, a nostalgic notion for when the time when libraries offered a lot of good services, and now the script has flipped, and tech services offer better services at better prices. And it's just completely ignorant viewpoint. And that's why I was, heckled until it was taken down off the internet. And on the right is another thing from the Pew Research from the previous slide in 2016, talking about that response about how libraries impact their communities. They're saying that Americans who have never been to libraries don't see as big of an impact as those who do, which, we can feel. It's definitely an effect that we all know about. Our library champions are in there talking about how great we do every day. And sometimes we meet people at a party and tell them you're a librarian. They ask, what is a librarian doing these days? Or why'd you have to go to school for that? Or all those kinds of things that you have to answer in your personal life. So that kind of makes some sense to me. And maybe you've run into those kinds of effects too. But I would kind of slump, without having known this author, I'd kind of slump him into the category of probably has not used a library recently, and so does not understand the impact on the community that the library has. I have another example. So people benefit from library services sometimes when they don't even know about it. So all of these op-eds and things and opinion pieces online about the library's worth and the digital age and all that kind of stuff, it's usually coming from the tech sector and business and economics and things like that. You usually don't see a lot of humanists or even a lot of academics posting about how we don't need libraries anymore. But I have an anecdote that might be a little illustrative, is that about 5 or 6 years ago, I attended a friend's PhD defense, and it was at a different university than where I live. And afterwards, we went out to lunch with their committee. And so I had my friend and a couple of friends that we had, mutual friends, and then their committee members, which is a bunch of professors from that university. And when we were talking, kind of introducing ourselves, at one point, like, oh, Justin's a librarian. And there's this chemistry professor who just looked straight at me. He was like, oh, that's a dead career, isn't it? And he just goes off on this like monologue that I don't know if he had prepared or if he had thought about this extensively, but he's just like, libraries aren't useful anymore. Everything's online. I never use them. And, I don't see their point, and hopefully you find a better career before you get, squashed out and you don't have a job anymore. And just all of this stuff that I was just aghast. And, I was a lot younger than he was, and it was my friend's defense. And I don't really feel like, putting this person in their place, but obviously he was entirely wrong. And if he worked at a university and was doing studies and had grad students, then he was obviously benefiting from a library. If the only obvious reason being access to research. So I know he's not purchasing subscriptions to all these databases and access to all this information for his own research on his own. I don't think he would do that. So just because he's never visited a library, he doesn't know that those online services that he takes for granted are actually through his library. And so that luncheon was not a proper time to confront this person on this issue. But I do think this happens quite a bit, and I do think we should have something prepared. So I think we should all think about like an elevator speech or other thing that we can have, something we can have in our back pocket, a list of statistics, relevant stories from our field, and other things that we do in libraries that not a lot of people know about, that we can more or less have on hand to dish out when we need to in those kinds of situations. So for this exercise, we have to kind of imagine what's the mindset of people who don't know about what's happening in libraries, and what do they know about them, or what can we assume that they know and don't know. And then think about, from their point of view, how would we promote libraries to them? And how do we speak in their language to make them understand? And how do we address the points that are important to them from a library's perspective? So often professors don't use academic libraries, they send their graduate assistants to do the work. That's an important, yeah, it was an important realization that I had too, is that I think they're so removed and they don't want to be bothered with that kind of work, or don't need to anymore, that they have a lot of assistants doing it for them. And they don't realize that that impact has on the library, or what the library's impact has on that work. Oh, someone else had a great teaching moment with a neighbor who said the same thing. Yeah, it does happen quite a bit. And especially when I was in grad school, I just get the question, you know, what are you doing that for? And I had to explain that, you know, it's a professional career. So it's the same way that other professions get credentialed. We have a similar process. And then when I explain to people that I do research and I publish in journals, not a lot of people know that. So I'm also having that conversation quite a bit too. Or conferences. I had another professor, I think it was economics at a different school. When I talked about going to a conference, he said, oh, they have library conferences. And I was like, yes, well, we all do very similar work and we share ideas just like they do in your field. So yeah, it's sometimes really baffling and really confusing that people who have gone through the process of higher education, especially have no clue about the role of a library in higher education, or the role of a public library in a community. It's kind of interesting if you think about it for a second. But overall, I think we are starting from a pretty good advantage, despite those dire cases that I just mentioned of being called out and questioned in public. I think overall, if you mention libraries to people, I think they have a pretty positive view of what they do, and are at least supportive of the notion of libraries. I don't think anybody questions the core concept of libraries. They might question the relevancy, quote unquote, in the digital age, but without knowing what digital services we have. But I don't think they question the idea of, you know, a space for knowledge and exchange of information, stuff like that. So we do have high range from people who use libraries, and we have our library champions, and we love them. And we have some opposition, some people who don't use libraries, which could extend into legislators, people creating bills, people holding the funding, administrative boards, organizations that provide oversight and consultation for city budgets and things like that, county budgets and state budgets. So this is part of our work, and this is all interconnected and important. And it's a really big task, and it's a really big challenge. But I think that if we work together, that we can try to address some of these challenges. So like I said, think about your elevator speech, and some people are sharing some more anecdotes in the chat. Thank you very much for that. But think about what you would say to that chemistry professor, or what you would say to others, or what you have said, and what you feel like has been impactful or interesting to them. And also think back to the people you wrote down to as your library support advocates from the reflection before. And do you know if they use libraries? So I didn't ask you to think about that part before, but for the people that you thought of who are your library supporters outside of working with people directly, do those people use libraries? Do your friends use libraries? And if so, what do they use them for, and what don't they use them for? Those are interesting things. It's like a fact-finding mission every once in a while. If you have the chance, when you're talking to friends, maybe don't talk about your work as much as ask them about, you know, hey, have you been to the library recently, or what do you do there, or, you know, why don't you go? And maybe not so accusatory, but that sort of way to exchange information. I think that'd be pretty helpful to know about. Oh, I just said the thing I had on the slide. Look back at what you wrote down as people would help you support libraries, and do you know if they use libraries or not? What do they use them for if they don't use them? And then thinking about your talking points for people who question your livelihood. So we are about halfway through, and hopefully spurred some interest or thoughts, and maybe got you thinking about, you know, the core concept of libraries, where we're coming from, what we do, what our talking points are, how we benefit our communities, and what we can promote to people outside of our sector, our public sector. So then I'll start talking a little bit about the levels of library advocacy, and I think there'll be some inspirational things here that we can then leverage into energy to actually go out and advocate. So hopefully in the last section, we'll give you resources and ideas and things about upcoming events and toolkits and all kinds of stuff where you can take these kinds of concepts and promote them to your local communities. And so when we think about the levels of library advocacy and advocacy in general, you think about what the individual can do on their own. And sometimes you can have a major change in the world just as an individual. But then you think about multiplying that effect as a group. And obviously the State Library Association is a great place to start for library advocacy, just because they're connected to a lot of people and across the state and people in and outside of the library sector. And so a state association is a wonderful place for advocacy. And then when you think about a group of groups or a collection of organizations working together, you think about coalitions, you think about all the shared resources that we have in networks across the United States for libraries. And then you also think about groups that are advocating for causes together and working together to amplify their own information and their own agendas so that they have more power and more presence in society. And so that's what we're going for, is magnifying the work of the individual in groups and teams so that we can take the burden off of any one person. But there is one person that I told you I went to library school, and I don't know if I mentioned I went to Florida State, but I did go to Florida State, and it was 2010 to 2012. So this is a story that I read about when I was attending library school. And it was a librarian in Florida, a systems librarian specifically, Paul Clark, who advocated for library funding when every year the state budget was trying to cut library funding and cut park funding and cut all this, all this kind of public funding. So in Florida, he would just go and take vacation days and go up to the Capitol in Tallahassee and stand there with a sign. And this article, which also disappeared from the web, but was on Internet Archive, it links to the story, and it's really interesting and heartwarming. He had never advocated before for anything, period. And he had been a librarian for a little bit, and then he saw that they were going to cut pretty much all the funding for libraries in the state of Florida. And he decided to just go and make a sign. So he went and made a sign and stood outside the Capitol and just talked to people and used his vacation days to do that. So obviously he was in a position where he had the opportunity. He was living in Tallahassee, and he also had the opportunity to use vacation days and spend that time in front of the Capitol. Not all of us have this ability to do that. But he was able to do it. He spent 17 days holding signs, talked to almost 80 people that were representatives, senators, and representatives for the state of Florida. And one representative, Alexander, said that when you see an individual citizen taking their own time to be heard, that makes a really big impression. And library funding was approved. So they restored it at the level that it was before, $21 million. And I thought what was really interesting is that, well, first of all, Paul Clark went back with a sign, just a big thank you sign, and stood outside again for another day and just said, thank you for funding libraries, which I think is great. You write a thank you card when you get a gift or something like that. So why not go and thank people after they do what we've asked them to do? But the other interesting thing was that he was specifically quoted in this article as saying that he needed the citizens of Florida to actually call in and write into the representatives to present this case, and that it wasn't enough for him alone to secure funding at this level again and again. So that's an interesting case of like one person did make a difference. Pretty convincingly, one person made a difference, but he also relied on support of people that he was talking to, connections that he had, and other people supporting libraries at the same time. And his whole outcome and whole messaging was, hey, I can't just do this by myself. So we need to create a team atmosphere. We need to attack this in an organized manner. And if we keep advocating for libraries, then we can make a difference like this. So this kind of group effort idea is that the individual can make a real change, but it's really hard to sustain that. We don't have enough time. Paul Clark doesn't have enough time to visit every state for 17 days to stand outside and talk to everybody about the importance of libraries. But as a group, we do have this kind of time. It multiplies out. And so if we only have an hour a week times 50 or 100 people on an advocacy team for a state group, then we'll have a lot more outcomes and a lot more energy and a lot more ability to convince people of our mission. And so these kind of facts are coming from ALA, is that state legislators are about 20 times more productive than Congress. So if you think of how long it takes something to go through Congress, the local action is going through a lot faster. I think it's just a lot easier for them to move through, sometimes because they don't hear any opposition. So there will be town halls where nobody's speaking up against it or for it, and they're just able to move stuff through a lot quicker. So keep that in mind, is that I think we read about the national news all the time, and we suffer from that, and we think about, you know, all the bad stuff that's happening and what can we do as an individual or as a citizen or as a group. Think about your local environment and think about what you can do in that realm, because although we can't really see people in person these days with a peaceful mind, we can think about, you know, my presence in my community and my advocacy for what I believe in my community, I think is going to have a bigger effect than advocating nationally to a state senator or a federal congressman, because I think there are fewer people involved on the local level. And you see that in local races and things like that, where there are people are racing uncontended. So they get the seat by default. So I think there's a lot less action in terms of local politics. People pay a little less attention because the national politics is such an extreme display and is so emotional and invoking in people. I think the state is where to do the focus most of the time. So 20 times more productive than Congress, and 86% of public library funding comes from local sources. So when you add that together and think about yourself and your colleagues and your group that can make a real impact on your local environment, then that would kind of ripple outwards. So if everyone does that locally, then hopefully we can have the momentum to make those changes and to show maybe they did this over in South Carolina, so maybe I can try and do this over in Georgia and have that same kind of momentum and use the ideas that they had to organize and use their talking points and things like that. And that's when we get to the groups of groups of groups of groups helping each other. So when we start talking about legislation that's happening all over the country on the same kind of topic, or we talk about advocacy methods that work across the country, then we start talking about basically crowdsourcing that knowledge and sharing it across organizations. So the example here is that there has been legislation across states in the South to try and defund libraries over a particular issue, which is the drag queen story hour. And so this is coming from ALA's Public Policy and Advocacy Office. They're saying last year, some conservative organizations ran a bill in a few state legislators that would have defunded public libraries that host drag queen story hour. And this was including Missouri, Tennessee, and Minnesota. And they're anticipating seeing those bills reintroduced. So even though they didn't go through, what happens is they trial run it, they see what worked and what didn't work, they tweak their messaging, and they run it again and again and again. And it's happened in various states, and it could keep happening and it could spread. And so likely additional states will see similar kinds of bills, because what happens is someone writes a bill and another state's like, hey, that looks really good, let me try and do that. And so they'll take the bill and just readapt it to their particular state. Or they might have a national organization that is well-funded, that tries to push these bills out across multiple states, more or less. So some kind of higher organization that's coordinating efforts across states. So with all that kind of stuff happening, in a way to defund a particular part of libraries, defund libraries who are participating in certain things, then we have to have some kind of opposition in place. And so what has happened is that these places that have gone up against these bills have crowdsourced their knowledge to ALA, and ALA's Public Policy and Advocacy Office and the Office for Intellectual Freedom have been working together to support states where this occurs by saying more or less, you know, libraries can create events that are appealing to their communities and that are welcoming and informative to people in their communities. And so we've had representatives threaten to defund Drag Queen Story Hour and threaten to defund universities over books selected for the first year reading. Yeah, so that's, yeah, immediately relevant. Megan was saying that about South Carolina. Definitely, so this is happening, and we have to understand that it could sometimes be a coordinated effort against libraries for particular political reasons or maybe other reasons. Funding issues, or they want to divert funding to another issue. So if that's already happening and we assume that's going to continue to happen, then we definitely need to advocate in a group format to combat those kinds of issues and have a similar structure in place where you have a national organization that can help provide support to local organizations. So then we start thinking about, you know, what is your advocacy plan, trying to put it all together. So who are your library champions and what do they stand for and what do they like to promote? And so some people are on social media now, some representatives, senators and other things, basically promoting what they want to promote. And so this was something that ALA provided to me as an example, is that advocacy is about building relationships, right? So we have to think about who are we in touch with, who are they in touch with, what kind of positions are they serving in, what kind of impact can they have on their constituents and their communities, where do our communities and their communities overlap, you know, all those kinds of shared interests. So it's all about building relationships and knowing people and talking, telling these stories over and over again. And it's about not waiting until there's a crisis or budget. And so it's easy to kind of assume like everything's going fine if our budget was reinstated, nothing's changed. But basically when the times are good is the exact time to start preparing for continued advocacy, because it's going to be a lot easier to get your head together and to get talking points in place and to organize people in advance when everything is relatively calm than when there's a crisis like right now where there's a million different things we have to look at and our attentions and focus and issues are all spread out across the spectrum. So when things start to quote unquote normalize, we can still try to advocate and group together to do so. So look at these recent posts from Senator Andy Levine, sponsor of the Library Stabilization Fund Act. And he was just telling the story of what they do in their family for libraries, saying that he and his wife have limitations on what their children are allowed to do. But when it comes to the library, take as many books as you want, like not a problem. So this is the kind of stuff that we want to hear from people in power and people representing our communities, is to tell the stories that we know about our library users. So he's saying I could talk about the benefit of libraries all day, but I think it's important to understand that they're more than just book repositories for their communities. And so all these examples across the country, providing hotspots and Wi-Fi, their libraries providing contact tracing now. Public library I worked in provide help with taxes. They had volunteers from AARP coming in to help, literally just help people with taxes line by line. Job services, telehealth, you know, all this kinds of stuff, from the very specific and small to the big broader things that have national impact, is that this stuff is happening, and sometimes it's not promoted or it's not in the news as much as we would like to see it. And so people have a rough time updating the concepts of libraries and what they do especially if they don't go through those doors and it's not reported in the news. And then somebody says, well, let's just close libraries because they don't do anything anymore. Those people who don't have that information are like, yeah, okay, well, that sounds legitimate. So we have to be vigilant, and we have to be always sharing about what we do. And we can do that at the individual level with friends and family and close associates. And we can do that at the group level with our state associations. And we can do that at the national level with ALA and other organizations that work across states and try and coordinate bigger efforts. To do that, we think about our library champions. We think about our library resources, what's available to us. So these are some of the things that you have available to you if you did not know. And these are our state and local advocacy pages. So I'm going to click through some of these, and hopefully it'll be a little illustrative to you. And then I'll give you the link to this presentation so you can click through on your own as well. So ALA does provide resources for state and local advocacy and messaging, especially related to the current crisis and what libraries have been doing, and state actions that you can take, and additional resources for nonprofits and other things like that. So there's a whole list there of potential useful links and documents and things like that. And then they also have pre-prepared messaging for you, libraries in COVID and response and what has been happening. And you can plug in some more information. You can plug in a picture and use this locally as a state resource. We also have best practices for advocacy websites. So if you wanted to get into the nitty-gritty of how do I make SCLA's website more effective for advocacy, they do have some examples of states that they pride as being good examples for advocacy, and they do have some good best practices on the left here, identifying policies, defining advocacy, providing clear messaging, and so on. So there's a lot of good information there on what we can do as a digital presence and what we can learn from others who have succeeded in that area. There's also a neat initiative under our committee, the Committee on Library Advocacy. There's a subcommittee for library ecosystem, and it kind of shows it here with this little arrow infographic. But it's basically showing that what we do on the national level of organizing also needs to be done on the local level. So library ecosystem is thinking about all the types of libraries and library workers and volunteers and staff that come together to provide library services. And so this is across public libraries, special libraries, college libraries, everything that we can think of as library workers and associates in a particular community or state. This is trying to get them on the same page and have shared interests and to share information with each other so that the benefits and challenges that they all face, they can communicate more easily. And so if there's a lot of training and workshops in one group, they might be able to provide that same kind of resource to another group in their local area. So there's an upcoming event with a webinar on who are the people in your ecosystem that will talk about trying to organize and reach across organizations at the state and local levels. And then there's also an Advocacy Academy, which is a training session that ALA's Public and Policy Advocacy Office has done and will continue to do, where they have training for library workers, volunteers, and supporters. That includes how to do a community assessment, how to map out things, and how to tell your library's story, and how to push your messaging out. So those are all things available from ALA. And here's some events too. Advancing your library agenda post-election. And like I said, building the library ecosystem. So advancing your library agenda after election. So it's really important to understand that we do a lot of work all the time, but after a new election, especially at the local, state, and national level, you want to try and get in on the ground floor with the people coming in and the people who've been around that are staying around. And so once they get in and settle in is the best time to hit them with the messaging that you have and the ideas you have for their term. they're fresh, they're not worn down by the office yet, they haven't heard 1,000 people complain about 1,000 different things. So getting in right after the election is a prime time to get our messaging across, and this goes for any level of government. So right after they take the oath of office and they're in and they're ready to go, we hit them with that messaging and talk to them about the importance of libraries. And then the ecosystem webinar is another thing that we can do in the upcoming. So to wrap it up in a little bit here, some of the final thoughts that I thought I'd pose to you, since like I said, I can't speak to your local environment and I can't speak to who you know and who's in power in your community and what funding you have and what services you have. These are some of the broad things that I think we could think about going forward for advocacy. So what are the barriers to advocacy and why don't we advocate? So if you think about it, you probably haven't advocated for part of your term as a librarian or in your workplace or in your community. So why haven't you? And don't be too hard on yourself. It's not a lot of people have a lot of time for a lot of extra things, but think about what are the barriers to that. So is it that I don't really know who my representative is? Is it that I don't think they're really gonna listen? Is that I don't have important information for them? Because those are all different questions with different answers that you can be supplied in different ways. So if all you need is statistics and information, there are ways to find that I think we know how to search out. But I think going through that process of reflection and thinking about what actual resources do I have and what don't I have and what do I need and how do I get it done and what's standing in the way. So when we think about those challenges, think about how to overcome those challenges and who we need to speak to and what we need to get started. And sometimes it might just be a matter of maybe I just need moral support. Maybe I need to meet with a few other people every once in a while and talk about how hard it is to do advocacy. And maybe that'll keep me going. So maybe you can start a coffee hour or coffee 15 minutes with friends and family and associates you think would be interested. So you have that list of names of people you think would be interested. Some of those reflections will help out with some of these final thoughts so that maybe you already have a head start on getting started with advocacy or continuing the advocacy you already do, because as workers, I think we're already advocating every day as we talk to people that we work with and our patrons and our family members about our work. I think that's definitely advocacy, and we need to extend that out above that to make sure we're advocating to representatives as well. And then think about what are the experiences of people who aren't like us. So this is a great tool for any kind of information research or anything you're doing with advocacy is thinking about, okay, we know what we know, but who are the people that don't know what we know and what don't they know? And how can we explain it to them in a way that they'll understand? So they might just not have been exposed to libraries. They might just have not been in a place where they needed to go to one. As a college student, as an undergraduate, I didn't visit a librarian, academic librarian at my institution for any help. And I went through several classes in several disciplines, and I never had a librarian come to instruct a class at Florida State, which is a large state college or a state university. And then after I was done with undergraduate, I went to grad school, and then I got a job, and now I'm working at a college library. And I'm like, oh, how do I get more students to come and talk to me? And I'm like, well, wait, I was a student, and for 4 years, I didn't talk to anybody at the library. I just went on the database by myself. I typed in my search terms. I went and found the books myself. So you got to think about that. What exposure do people have? And maybe people who are using the library, but we don't see them because they don't talk to us. Maybe they're still benefiting, and maybe we can talk to them about what are they benefiting from and how can we advertise their stories too. And then who are our champions? So are our representatives talking about what we do? And is our mayor talking about what we do? And who can we extend the invite to come and see what we do? And sometimes building that relationship, you don't want to be pushy right away. You kind of want to go and talk to them about what they're doing. It's always easier to get people to talk about their own interests and what they're doing because, they're interested in talking about what they do. And then maybe slipping in along the way, oh, hey, did you know at the library we're doing this thing? So maybe the soft sell of like getting to know them and talking to them about what they do in the community. And then just kind of over time, slipping in some of those stories about libraries and some statistics and challenges that we face with library funding and staffing and all that. And then think about how can we raise the profile of libraries. So one good way of doing it is to receive grants and awards. And it takes resources and time and effort to do those kinds of things. But I'll be honest, I've written grant applications, and I've gotten to a point now where I've reviewed grants. And I think overall, I don't think enough places are applying for grants. It might be not knowing that they're out there. It might be not having time or dedicated staff to do it, which is totally understandable. I've worked at a small public library where I was working, 10-hour shifts, skipping lunches, and I was not going to write a grant. But the idea is that there are a lot of grant opportunities. And when I reviewed grants, I was like, I don't think there's enough applicants for this. I think there could have been a lot more, and we could have a bigger pool and a bigger effect for what happens with this grant money. So I think that is one thing that it brings attention. So when I did get a grant in the public library, the local news came and interviewed me and put me in the newspaper. I was like, oh, this is cool. I didn't even know this was a thing. When I was in library school, I never imagined this happening. So the idea that word can spread out, and if other external institutions are granting money to your library, it looks really good. Like, oh, they're doing something important, because we are doing something important. And so that generates positive news, and it gets other people involved and interested in what the libraries are doing. And it looks great for the county board, and it looks great for the state and for the county to show that you're bringing in outside money too. News stories, op-eds. So even if you don't have time to write a grant or go through that process, write into your local newspaper and just talk about what's going on at the library. I don't think enough people do that either. I mean, we have op-eds all the time, but I think there could be a lot more of those. And then think about, how do we develop and update advocacy plans? So we have plans for everything else. We have plans for emergency situations. I grew up in Florida, in Central Florida. We had a hurricane plan. We would go and stay. My dad worked at a hospital, so we could go and stay there. It was like windproof or whatever. So we have emergency plans, and we have plans for voting, and we have all kinds of plans. But what's our advocacy plan, and how do we keep it motivated and interested in our own heads and our own jobs, and try and keep going with advocacy? And usually it just means probably working with more people. The individual can't do it alone. So if you have an advocacy plan, hopefully it involves others who help keep you accountable if you're having trouble keeping on top of your advocacy plans. And then just think about, how do we tell these stories to ourselves and to our coworkers in libraries? How do we talk about the work that we do? And then how do we retell these stories outside of libraries? And what kinds of things do we want to focus on? And what do we want to promote? So that kind of reflection is really powerful. And doing that in your spare time will help you with those kinds of elevator speeches. And if you run into somebody in power or somebody who doesn't know about libraries, then you can tell them in 30 seconds or less what's really important, and you don't have to think about it, right? It's more like a rote repetition kind of thing. So if we're able to equip ourselves with that mindset, to adopt other people's mindsets, and to tell our stories over and over again at multiple levels and through groups and groups of groups, then I think we'll be pretty effective, and we'll have more sway on what happens in libraries, and we'll have more funding and more staffing and things like that, where we can do even more great things that we can talk about. So that's the whole idea, and hopefully that encouraged you a little bit to think about what you go through in your daily work and who you can leverage within your work and outside of work that can help you with advocacy. So if you have any ideas, feel free to share them now in the chat. Feel free to unmute and tell me about where you're coming from or ideas you have in your area. And then also feel free to get in touch, jcruz@auctr.edu.
I don't see our, we have 2 co-chairs this year for our advocacy committee, and I do not see them in the chat, but this was so informative. Thank you so much, Justin. I've learned so much, and I definitely am excited. So that ALA Advocacy Academy, is that like I could do that on my own, or do I have to like register to go through that?
It's a registration process because we do it on a kind of a state-by-state basis. So Megan Cusick is the one who normally organizes that in the PPA office, but that link is in here too. I'm going to copy this link and put it in the chat now. I forgot to do that. I was going to do that at the beginning, but so all of the links to everything that I clicked on today is in that link for the presentation. And I'll also email it to you so you have that. But yeah, the advocacy camp is a way to more formally engage with your situation. So it's not a self-paced or thing like that. It's more of a specific detailed look at your region. So Megan would be the one to talk to about that one.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming out, and I appreciate your time, and I hope you had a great conference. And feel free to get in touch with any ideas, and especially if you're interested in the Committee on Library Advocacy, it'd be great to hear from you.
Thank you, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah.